Tommy Bradshaw had been drinking since noon, and by 4 o'clock. The anger that had been building inside him for months finally found a target. At 28, he had lost his job at the factory his girlfriend had left him. His father had died without ever telling him he was proud. The world felt like it was against him, and today, standing outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, with a bottle of cheap whiskey in his jacket, now Tommy was looking for someone to blame. The tourists around him were taking photos and laughing there. Happiness making his own misery feel deeper. Families posed for pictures, children pointed excitedly at the guards, and couples held hands while marveling at the ceremony. All of it disgusted Tommy. These people had money to travel. It's time to enjoy themselves. It's now lives that weren't falling apart. Guard Michael Thompson stood at his post with the discipline that had made him one of the most respected members of his unit. At 35, he had served 2 tours in Iraq and 3 years as a ceremonial guard. His wife Emma was 6 months pregnant with their first child, and his mind often drifted to thoughts of becoming a father while maintaining the perfect stillness his position required. The crowd was larger than usual for a Wednesday afternoon. School groups, tourists from around the world, and locals showing visiting relatives the famous guards created a colorful sea of faces and cameras. Michael had learned to tune out the noise and movement, focusing instead on his duties and the pride he felt in representing his country. Tommy pushed through the crowd, his movements becoming more aggressive as the alcohol took hold. He bumped into a Japanese tourist taking photos, causing the man to stumble. "Watch where you're going," Tommy slurred. Though he had been the one doing the pushing, the tourist apologized politely and moved away, not wanting confrontation. But Tommy's anger was only getting stronger. He looked around for something, anything, to focus his rage on. That's when he saw a guard. Thompson standing perfectly still in his red uniform and tall black bearskin hat. Something about the guard's composure, his dignity, as a representation of authority and tradition, made Tommy's anger boil over. "Look at this one," Tommy said loudly to no one in particular, standing there like he's better than everyone else. Few tourists glanced at Tommy with concern, noticing his unsteady movement and slurred speech. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, sensing trouble. Michael heard the comment, but maintained his focus straight ahead. In 3 years of ceremonial duty, he had dealt with countless drunk or disorderly visitors. Most could be ignored until security personnel removed them.
Oh.
This felt different, though. There was a viciousness in the man's voice that set off Michael's combat-trained instincts. Tommy stumbled closer to the guard, his voice getting louder. "What makes you so special, eh? Standing there in your fancy costume, while real people struggle to survive?" The crowd began to take notice. Phones came out, not to photograph the ceremony, but to record what looked like it might become an incident. Parents moved their children away from the drunk man, who was clearly becoming more agitated. "You don't know what real life is like," Tommy continued, now speaking directly to Michael's face. "You just stand there playing dress-up while people like me lose everything." Michael's training kicked in. He had dealt with aggressive individuals before, both in combat and in ceremonial duty. The key was to remain calm, maintain position, and let security handle the situation. But something about this man's pain, even expressed through anger and alcohol, reminded him of soldiers he had served with who had struggled with their own demons. Tommy took another step closer, close enough that Michael could smell the alcohol. On his breath, the crowd fell silent, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. "You think you're untouchable in that uniform?" Tommy's voice cracked with emotion that went deeper than just anger. "You think you're above the rest of us?" Security personnel were moving through the crowd, but they were still several yards away.
Ow.
Michael calculated their distance while maintaining his ceremonial posture. Then Tommy did something that shocked everyone watching. He gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly at Michael's face. The spit hit Michael's cheek and began to run down toward his uniform collar. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people cried out in disgust and shock. Cameras clicked, and phones recorded as tourists from around the world witnessed what appeared to be one of the most disrespectful acts possible against a Queen's Guard. For a moment that seemed to last forever, nobody moved. Tommy stood, swaying slightly, surprised by his own action. The crowd waited to see how the guard would respond. Security personnel pushed through the crowd more urgently. Michael felt the warm spit on his face, felt it running down his cheek. His military training told him to maintain position and let authorities handle the situation. His pride told him that he had been insulted in the worst possible way in front of hundreds of people. His anger told him that this drunk deserved whatever. Consequences were coming, but something else happened in that moment of silence. Michael looked directly into Tommy's eyes for the first time, breaking his ceremonial composure just enough to really see the man in front of him. What he saw wasn't just anger or disrespect. He saw pain that reminded him of his own worst moments, desperation that he recognized from his time in combat zones, and a brokenness that spoke to something deeper than simple, drunken aggression. The security personnel were almost through the crowd. In seconds, Tommy would be arrested, probably charged with assault, and become just another cautionary tale about disrespecting the monarchy. The incident would be forgotten by everyone except Tommy, who would carry the shame and consequences. For years, in that split second of decision, Michael Thompson made a choice that would surprise everyone watching, including himself. Instead of maintaining his rigid posture or waiting for security to handle the situation, Michael did something that no one expected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean handkerchief. Without saying a word, he handed it to Tommy. The crowd fell completely silent. Even Tommy stopped swaying and stared at the handkerchief in confusion. "You look like you need this?" "More than I do," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear. The simple gesture, offered without anger or condemnation, hit Tommy like a physical blow. The kindness in the face of his own cruelty broke something inside him that had been building for months. Tommy stared at the handkerchief in Michael's outstretched hand, his alcohol-fogged mind struggling to process what was happening. He had just committed one of the most disrespectful acts possible, and instead of anger or retaliation, he was being offered kindness. The silence stretched across the crowd like a held breath. Tourists who had been taking photos now stood with their cameras lowered, witnessing something they had never expected to see. Children who had been laughing and playing now watched quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if they didn't understand it. Tommy's hand trembled as he reached for the handkerchief. The simple white cloth felt impossibly heavy in his fingers, weighted with a kindness he didn't deserve. Tommy's voice cracked, and tears began mixing with the alcohol flush on his cheeks. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Michael maintained his position but kept his eyes on Tommy's face. In 3 years of ceremonial duty, he had never broken protocol like this. But something about the man's obvious pain had touched, something deeper than military training. The security personnel finally reached them, but they hesitated when they saw the guard handing his handkerchief to the man who had just assaulted him. Sergeant Williams, the senior security officer, had dealt with hundreds of incidents around the palace, but this was unlike anything in his experience. "Sir," Sergeant Williams said to Tommy, "I need you to come with me." Tommy nodded, wiping his face with the handkerchief. The gesture seemed to break the dam of emotion he had been holding back for months. His shoulders began to shake as the full weight of what he had done hit him. "Please," he said to Michael, "I need you to know that this isn't who I am. I'm not this person." Michael nodded slightly, another break in protocol that didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. "I know," he said quietly. As Sergeant Williams led Tommy away, the crowd began to murmur among themselves. Several tourists were reviewing the footage they had captured, amazed by what they had witnessed. An elderly woman from Scotland approached Michael's position. "Young man," she said softly, "that was the most decent thing I've ever seen." But Michael was already returning to his ceremonial posture, though the emotional impact of the encounter was still visible in his eyes. He had made a choice in that moment that went against every protocol he had been taught, but felt completely right in the security office. Tommy sat across from Sergeant Williams while paperwork was being prepared. The charge would be assault on a royal guard, a serious offense that carried significant penalties. "This will likely mean jail time," Sergeant Williams explained. "Assault on a ceremonial guard is taken very seriously. You're looking at several months in prison, a substantial fine, and a permanent criminal record." Tommy nodded numbly. He deserved whatever punishment was coming. What haunted him wasn't the consequences he would face, but the memory of the guard's kindness in response to his cruelty. "The guard," Tommy said quietly. "Will he be in trouble for helping me?" Sergeant Williams paused in his paperwork. "Helping? You," he gave me his handkerchief. "He spoke to me. He broke his ... whatever you call it, his position." "Protocol," Sergeant Williams said. "Yes, there will probably be questions about that." The thought that his actions might have consequences for the man who had shown him kindness made Tommy feel even worse. Only had he disgraced himself. But he might have caused problems for the one person who had treated him with dignity. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of Michael's unit, was reviewing reports of the incident. Multiple witnesses had described the unusual way the situation had been handled, and he had been called to investigate. Michael stood in the colonel's office, still in his ceremonial uniform, but now facing questions about his conduct. "Thompson," Colonel Harrison began, "you understand that maintaining discipline and protocol is essential to the dignity of your position?" "Yes, sir." "Then explain to me why you chose to engage with an individual who had just assaulted you." Michael considered his words carefully. "Sir, I looked at the man and saw someone in pain. My response was instinctive." "Instinctive," the colonel repeated. "Your instinct was to comfort someone who had just spit in your face." "My instinct was to help someone who clearly needed help, sir." Colonel Harrison studied Michael's service. Record: 2 tours of combat duty with distinction, 3 years of exemplary ceremonial service, commendations for conduct under pressure. This was not a soldier who made poor decisions lightly. "Thompson, do you understand that this incident has been filmed and is already spreading on social media? Your actions will be seen by thousands, possibly millions of people." "I understand, sir." "And do you regret your decision?" Michael thought about Tommy's face when he had accepted the handkerchief, the way his anger had crumbled into shame and gratitude. "No, sir, I don't regret it." The colonel leaned back in his chair. In 20 years of military service, he had learned to recognize soldiers who acted from genuine principle versus those who simply made mistakes. Michael Thompson was clearly the former. "The palace has received over 200 messages in the past 3 hours, Colonel Harrison said. "Would you like to know what they say?" Michael remained silent. "They're calling you a hero. They're saying your response showed the best of British character. There are requests for interviews, invitations to speak at events, and several charities have asked if you would be willing to support their work." The news surprised Michael. He had expected disciplinary action, not praise. However, the colonel continued, "There are also complaints. Some people feel that you should have maintained protocol regardless of the circumstances. They argue that ceremonial positions are about upholding tradition, not making individual moral judgments." Michael nodded, understanding both perspectives. "So the question becomes," Colonel Harrison said, "whether your actions enhanced or damaged the reputation of the Queen's Guard." Back in the holding cell, Tommy was experiencing withdrawal symptoms as the alcohol wore off. But worse than the physical discomfort was the emotional weight of what he had done. The guard's kindness had forced him to confront the person he had become, someone who would spit on a stranger because his own life had fallen apart. Dr. Sarah Chen, counselor who worked with the court system to evaluate defendants, arrived to assess Tommy's mental state before his hearing. "Tell me about what led to today's incident," she said. Sitting across from him in the small interview room, Tommy found himself telling her everything. It's about losing his job when the factory closed, about his girlfriend leaving because he had become bitter and angry, about his father's recent death, and the conversation they had never had about forgiveness and love. "The guard," Tommy said, "when he gave me that handkerchief, it was like he saw something in me that I had forgotten existed. Something worth saving." Dr. Chen made notes as Tommy spoke. She had evaluated hundreds of defendants, and she recognized genuine remorse when she saw it. "What do you think you would do differently if you had the chance?" she asked. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "I would ask for help, instead of looking for someone to blame. I would try to be the kind of person who deserves kindness instead of someone who spits at it." The handkerchief, now stained with tears and alcohol, sat folded in Tommy's pocket. It had become more than just a piece of cloth. It was a reminder that even in his darkest moment, someone had chosen to see his humanity instead of just his actions. The video of the incident had been viewed over 2 million times within 24 hours. News outlets across Britain and beyond were running stories about the compassionate guard and the drunk man whose assault had been met with kindness. Instead of punishment, Michael Thompson sat in his small flat, watching the news coverage with his pregnant wife, Emma. Still struggling to process how quickly their private lives had been thrust into the public eye, "They're calling you the guardian angel of Buckingham Palace," Emma said, reading comments on her phone. "Listen to this one. In a world full of anger and division, this guard showed us what true strength looks like." Michael shifted uncomfortably. On the sofa, "I just did what felt right in the moment. I didn't think about cameras or consequences. Maybe that's why it meant so much to people," Emma replied. It was genuine. The phone rang constantly, journalists wanting interviews, television producers offering appearances, and ordinary people calling to express their support. Michael had stopped answering after the 15th call. Meanwhile, Tommy Bradshaw was experiencing a very different kind of attention. The court hearing that was supposed to be routine had become a media spectacle, with reporters gathered outside the courthouse hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had assaulted a royal guard. His appointed solicitor, David Morrison, met with him before the hearing to discuss their options. "The public reaction has been complicated," Morrison explained. "Obviously what you did was serious, but the guard's response has generated enormous sympathy for both of you." "I don't want sympathy," Tommy said firmly. "I want to face the consequences of what I did." Morrison paused, surprised by his client's attitude. Most defendants in his experience were eager to minimize their punishment, not insist on accepting it. "Tommy, there's something else you should know. Guard Michael Thompson has submitted a statement to the court." Tommy looked up with concern. "Is he pressing additional charges?" "No. He's asking for leniency in your sentencing." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. Even after what he had done, the guard was still trying to help him. Morrison read from the statement, "While I cannot condone the defendant's actions, I believe they came from a place of pain rather than malice. I have seen good men do terrible things when they are struggling, and I believe Mr. Bradshaw is fundamentally a good man facing difficult circumstances." Tommy put his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the continued kindness from someone he had wronged so deeply. In the courtroom, Magistrate Jennifer Walsh reviewed the case file with growing interest. In 15 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a case that had captured public attention in such an unusual way. When Tommy entered the courtroom, he was surprised to see it packed with observers. Media representatives filled the press section. But there were also ordinary citizens who had been following the story. "Mr. Bradshaw," Magistrate Walsh began, "you are charged with assault on a royal guard. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Tommy said without hesitation. A murmur went through the courtroom. Morrison had advised him that he could plead not guilty by reason of diminished capacity due to alcohol, but Tommy had insisted on accepting full responsibility. "Before we proceed to sentencing," Magistrate Walsh said, "I understand there are several people who wish to make statements to the court." Dr. Chen was the first to speak, presenting her psychological evaluation of Tommy and her assessment that he posed no ongoing threat to public safety. Then, to everyone's surprise, Michael Thompson entered the courtroom in his dress uniform. He had requested permission to address the court personally. "Your Honor," Michael said, standing at attention, "I would like to speak on behalf of Mr. Bradshaw." The courtroom fell completely silent. "What Mr. Bradshaw did to me was wrong, and I'm not here to excuse it. But I am here to ask the court too. Consider that sometimes good people make terrible mistakes when they are in pain." Michael turned slightly to look at Tommy, who was staring at him with tears in his eyes. "I have served in combat zones where I've seen men pushed beyond their limits. I've seen what desperation can do to people who would normally never hurt anyone. Mr. Bradshaw wasn't acting out of malice, he was acting out of despair." The magistrate listened intently as Michael continued. "I believe that punishment should serve a purpose. In this case, I believe Mr. Bradshaw has already been punished by his own conscience. What he needs now is not jail time, but support to rebuild his life." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter. "I've spoken with several organizations that work with veterans and others who are struggling with unemployment and grief. They have agreed to provide Mr. Bradshaw with counseling, job training, and support services. He handed the letter to the court clerk. I would like to request that Mr. Bradshaw be sentenced to community service, with the requirement that he participate in these support programs. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as people processed what they were hearing. Tommy was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the continued generosity of the man he had wronged. Magistrate. Walsh reviewed the letter and the various psychological evaluations and character references that had been submitted. Mr. Bradshaw, she said, please stand. Tommy rose on unsteady legs, still clutching the handkerchief Michael had given him. This court finds your actions reprehensible and unacceptable. Assault on any individual is serious, but assault on someone serving in an official capacity is particularly grave. Tommy nodded, prepared for the worst. However, the magistrate continued, this court also recognizes that justice is not always served by punishment alone. Sometimes justice requires us to look for solutions that address the root causes of criminal behavior. She paused, looking directly at Tommy. You are sentenced to 200 hours of community service to be completed over the next 12 months. You will also participate in counseling and job training programs as recommended by the court. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, quickly silenced by the magistrate's gavel. Additionally, Magistrate Walsh said, you will write a letter of apology to be read at schools and community centers as part of an educational program about respect and conflict resolution. Tommy nodded through his tears, grateful for the opportunity to make amends. As the court session ended, Michael approached Tommy in the hallway outside the courtroom. Thank you, Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand why you're helping me, but thank you. Michael extended his hand for a handshake. Everyone deserves a second chance to be the person they really are. Tommy shook his hand, feeling the strength and sincerity in Michael's grip. I want you to know, Tommy said, that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the kindness you've shown me. You already are worthy, Michael replied. Just forgot for a while. As they parted ways outside the courthouse, both men knew that their lives had been permanently changed by their brief encounter. The incident that could have been just another example of public disorder had become something much more profound, a demonstration of how compassion could transform both the giver and the receiver. 6 months after the incident, Tommy Bradshaw stood in front of a group of teenagers at a community center in East London, holding the same handkerchief that Michael Thompson had given him on that life-changing day. This, Tommy said, holding up the now faded white cloth, represents the moment someone chose to see the best in me when I was showing them my worst. The teenagers, many of whom had their own struggles with anger and disappointment, listened with surprising attention. Tommy's story had become part of a traveling educational program about conflict resolution and second chances. I want you to understand something, Tommy continued. When I spit at that guard, I thought I was showing him how angry I was at the world. Really, I was showing him how much I hated myself. A young girl in the front row raised her hand. What made you so angry? Tommy had answered this question dozens of times over the past months, but it never got easier. I lost my job, my girlfriend left me, and my dad died before we could fix our relationship. I felt like the world was against me, so I decided to be against the world. He walked closer to the group, his voice becoming more personal. But here's what I learned from that guard. When you're hurting, you have two choices. You can spread that hurt to other people, or you can ask for help dealing with it. Meanwhile, Michael Thompson was facing his own new reality. The incident had made him a reluctant celebrity, but more importantly, it had opened doors to work he had never considered. Colonel Harrison had called him into his office that morning with an unusual proposition. Thompson, the colonel said, I've received a request from the Ministry of Defense. They want to develop a new training program for military personnel about de-escalation and community relations. Michael sat forward with interest. The program would combine traditional military discipline with conflict resolution techniques. They want you to help design and lead it. Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not a trained counselor or educator. Colonel Harrison smiled. No, but you're someone who proved that military bearing and human compassion aren't mutually exclusive. That's exactly what they're looking for. The offer represented a significant career change. Michael would be promoted to sergeant and transferred to a new unit focused on community engagement and training. There's one more thing, the colonel added. They want you to work with civilian organizations as well. Police, social services, schools, anyone who deals with conflict situations. Michael thought about Emma and their baby, now 2 months old. The new position would mean regular hours and no more ceremonial duties, allowing him to be home more often. I accept, sir. The decision led to Michael and Tommy's paths crossing again in an unexpected way. The Ministry of Defense's new program was partnering with the same community organizations where Tommy was doing his service hours. They met again at a job training center in South London, where Michael was observing counseling programs as part of his research for the new military training curriculum. Michael, Tommy called out, hardly believing he was seeing the guard again. Michael turned and broke into a smile. When he recognized Tommy, the change in the man was remarkable. Tommy had gained healthy weight. His eyes were clear, and he carried himself with dignity that had been absent during their first encounter. "Tommy, you look well." "I feel well," Tommy replied. "Thanks to you." They sat together in the center's cafeteria, catching up on the months since the court hearing. "I've been clean for 6 months," Tommy told him. "The counseling program helped me understand that I was drinking to avoid dealing with my father's death and my own failures." "That takes courage," Michael said. "I've also been working with a construction company. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work, and they're teaching me new skills." Michael felt genuine pride in Tommy's progress. "I'm glad to hear it. What about you? Are you still standing guard at the palace?" Michael explained his new role and the training program he was helping to develop. "So, in a way," Tommy said with a slight smile, "my terrible behavior led to something good for both of us." "Your behavior led to consequences," Michael corrected gently. "Your choice to change your life led to something good." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah Martinez, the director of the Job Training Center, who approached their table with excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you two the men from the Buckingham Palace incident?" Both men nodded, still somewhat uncomfortable with their unwanted fame. "I have a proposition for you both," Sarah continued. "We've been asked to develop a program for people struggling with anger management and conflict resolution. Having both perspectives, someone who has struggled with these issues and someone who responded to them with compassion, would be incredibly valuable." She sat down at their table, her enthusiasm evident. The program would combine practical job training with emotional support and conflict resolution skills. "Tommy, your experience overcoming personal crisis would help people see that change is possible. Michael, your military background and natural counseling instincts would provide structure and leadership." Tommy and Michael looked at each other, both intrigued by the possibility. "What would this involve?" Michael asked. "Initially, speaking 2 groups together about your experience, eventually maybe developing a full curriculum that other centers could use." Tommy felt a flutter of nervousness. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to help other people. I barely figured out how to help myself." "That's exactly what makes you qualified," Sarah replied. "People trust someone who has been where they are and found a way forward." Over the following weeks, Michael and Tommy began working together on what would become known as the Second Chance program. Their first joint presentation was to a group of veterans struggling with unemployment and addiction. The combination of Michael's military authority and Tommy's raw honesty about his own failures created a powerful dynamic. Veterans who had been resistant to traditional counseling approaches found themselves opening up to these 2 men who clearly understood both service and struggle. "The thing about rock bottom," Tommy told one group, "is that it's solid. You can build on it." Michael would then follow up with practical strategies for managing anger and finding purpose. Drawn from his military training and modified for civilian situations, word of their success spread quickly. Social services departments began referring clients to their programs. Corporate human resources departments invited them to speak about workplace conflict resolution. Even schools asked them to address students about bullying and peer pressure. Emma Thompson watched her husband's transformation with amazement. The man who had once stood silent and motionless for hours was now speaking passionately to hundreds of people about compassion and second chances. "You know what I love most about this?" she told Michael one evening as they watched their baby daughter sleep. "What's that?" "You're still protecting people. You're just doing it differently now." Michael considered her words. She was right. His fundamental mission hadn't changed. He was still serving others, still upholding values of duty and service. But now he was doing it through connection rather than ceremony. The handkerchief that had started everything now traveled with them to every presentation. A tangible reminder of how a small act of kindness could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. Tommy had it framed along with a letter from Michael that read, "To remind us both that everyone deserves compassion, especially when they least expect it." Their partnership had grown from a moment of crisis into something neither had imagined possible, a collaboration that was helping people across Britain learn to respond to conflict with understanding rather than anger. 2 years after their first encounter, Michael Thompson and Tommy Bradshaw stood before an audience of 500 people at the Royal Festival Hall in London. The Second Chance program had grown from a local initiative into a national movement, with centers across the United Kingdom adopting their approach to conflict resolution and personal transformation. The audience that evening included government officials, charity workers, former program participants, and families whose lives had been touched by their work. In the front row sat Emma Thompson, holding her now 2-year-old daughter Sarah, who had been named after the job center director who had first brought Michael and Tommy together. 3 years ago, Michael began his presentation. "I thought, understood what service meant. I believed that standing perfectly still and representing tradition was the highest form of duty I could perform." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before continuing. "Then a desperate man taught me that real service isn't about maintaining distance from people's problems. It's about connecting with them in their moment of greatest need." Tommy waited for his cue, still amazed that he was speaking to such a distinguished audience. The nervous, angry man who had stumbled drunk through the crowds at Buckingham Palace seemed like a different person from a different lifetime. "I came to that palace looking for someone to blame for my failures," Tommy said as he stepped forward. "I found someone who refused to let me define myself by my worst moment." The presentation they had developed over dozens of previous talks combined personal testimony with practical strategies. But tonight was special. They were announcing the launch of an international program that would take their approach to other countries. Dr. James Mueller from the World Health Organization had been studying their methods for 6 months, documenting the measurable improvements in mental health outcomes among program participants. The Thompson-Bradshaw model, Dr. Mueller told the audience, has achieved something remarkable. They've created a system where people who have experienced both sides of conflict, the person in crisis and the person responding to crisis, work together to help others. The statistics he presented were impressive. Recidivism rates among program participants were 60% lower than traditional anger management programs. Employment rates among graduates were 40% higher than similar demographic groups. Most significantly, participants reported sustained improvements in relationships and overall life satisfaction. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the human stories that made the program so powerful in the audience. That evening was Janet Morrison, a single mother who had entered the program after a breakdown that nearly cost her custody of her children. She had been referred by social services after incidents of public disorder stemming from her struggles with depression and unemployment. Before this program, Janet had told a local television reporter earlier that day, "I thought people like Michael, people in uniform, people in authority, couldn't understand what my life was like. And I thought people like Tommy were just making excuses for bad behavior." Janet's transformation had been gradual but profound. The combination of practical job training, emotional support, and the example of 2 men who had turned a moment of conflict into a partnership had given her hope she had thought was lost forever. "Seeing them work together," she continued, "showed me that change is possible, that people really can become better versions of themselves." Janet now worked as a peer counselor in the program, helping other parents who were struggling with the challenges of raising children while dealing with personal crises. The international expansion of the program had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The United Nations had inquired about adapting their methods for refugee camps and post-conflict zones. Corporate training companies wanted to license their conflict resolution techniques for workplace applications. Even military organizations in several countries were studying their approach for use in community relations training. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Sir Edward Phillips. The Lord Chamberlain approached the podium during the evening ceremony to make a special announcement. Her Majesty has followed the development of the Second Chance program with great interest, Sir Edward said. She believes that it represents the finest traditions of British service, the idea that our institutions exist to help people become their best selves. The audience fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to be announced. Therefore, Her Majesty is pleased to announce that both Mr. Thompson and Mr. Bradshaw will be awarded the British Empire Medal for services to community relations and conflict resolution. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes. Tommy felt tears streaming down his cheeks as he thought about the journey from spitting at a guard to receiving. 5 years after the incident that changed their lives, Michael Thompson and Tommy Bradshaw stood in the departure lounge at Heathrow Airport, preparing to board a flight to New York City. The United Nations had invited them to address the General Assembly about conflict resolution and community healing, the culmination of their journey from a moment of violence to a global movement of compassion. The Second Chance program, now operated in 18 countries, had helped over 50,000 people and had been studied by universities around the world as a model for transformative justice. But for Michael and Tommy, the most meaningful measure of their success wasn't in statistics or international recognition. It was in the individual lives that had been changed. Tommy carried a leather portfolio containing hundreds of letters from program participants, former addicts, reformed violent offenders, and families that had been reunited after periods of crisis. Each letter was a reminder that their accidental partnership had created ripple effects they were still discovering. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Bradshaw. A young woman approached them hesitantly at the gate. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to. Thank you." They turned to see Rachel Williams, a university student who looked vaguely familiar. "I was at your presentation at Oxford last year," she explained. "I was going through a really difficult time, my parents' divorce, academic pressure, and I was dealing with a lot of anger issues." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Your story made me realize that I didn't have to let my anger define me. I got help, learned healthier ways to cope with stress, and now I'm studying to become a counselor myself." Rachel handed them a small, wrapped package. "I made this for you." Inside was a handkerchief embroidered with the words, "Everyone deserves compassion," in multiple languages. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that your message is spreading in ways you might never know about," she said as their flight was called for boarding. Michael and Tommy reflected on how many similar encounters they had experienced. Over the years, their story had become larger than either of them, taking on a life of its own as people around the world found meaning in their unlikely partnership. On the plane, Tommy pulled out a worn notebook where he had been writing his memoir at Michael's encouragement. "Listen to this," he said, reading from a recent entry. "5 years ago, I thought strength meant making other people feel as bad as I felt. Now I know that real strength is helping other people feel better than you feel." Michael smiled.
Yes.
"Going in the UN speech, you think they'll understand what we're talking about? All those diplomats and officials who've never been drunk and desperate in front of Buckingham Palace? They've all been desperate in their own ways," Michael replied. "Maybe not drunk, maybe not in public, but everyone has moments when they're not their best self. That's what makes our message universal." The flight gave them time to review their presentation and think about how their message might translate to an international audience dealing with conflicts between nations rather than individuals. Dr. Elizabeth Muller, their academic partner from the University of Vienna, had helped them prepare materials showing how their principles of personal conflict resolution could be applied to diplomatic and international situations. The same dynamics that work between individuals can work between groups, she had explained during their preparation sessions. Responding to underlying needs rather than surface behaviors, choosing empathy over judgment, creating opportunities for transformation rather than just punishment. When they arrived in New York, they were met by Sarah Martinez, their original JOB Center Director who had become the international coordinator for the Second Chance program. She had flown in to support their UN presentation and to attend meetings about expanding the program to refugee camps and post-conflict zones. How are you feeling about tomorrow? She asked as they rode in the taxi toward their hotel. Nervous, Tommy admitted. It's one thing to talk to people who are struggling with the same issues I've struggled with. It's another thing to address world leaders about international peace. But that's exactly why you're the right people for this, Sarah replied. Not politicians or diplomats. You're two ordinary people who found an extraordinary way to turn conflict into cooperation. That evening, they walked through Times Square, marveling at how far their journey had taken them from the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace.
Ow.
Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just let security arrest me that day? Asked as they watched the crowds of tourists and street performers. Michael considered the question seriously, as he had many times over the years. I think about it sometimes, he said. You probably would have served some jail time, maybe gotten the help you needed eventually. I would have continued standing guard, doing my duty the way I understood it then. Thousands of people wouldn't have been helped by our program. Maybe someone else would have figured out how to combine military discipline with civilian counseling. Maybe the lesson would have been learned a different way. Tommy shook his head. I don't think so. What made our partnership work wasn't just the combination of our backgrounds. It was the fact that we had both been changed by that moment. You by choosing compassion, me by receiving it when I didn't deserve it. The next morning, they stood in the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations, looking out at delegates. From 193 countries, the circular seating arrangement and simultaneous translation equipment made it feel like they were addressing the entire world. Secretary General Antonio Guterres introduced them with words that still amazed Tommy every time. He heard similar introductions. 5 years ago, these two men were strangers whose lives intersected in a moment of conflict. Today, they represent a proven model for transforming that conflict into cooperation, healing, and hope. Michael stepped to the podium first, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. Distinguished delegates, he began, we stand before you, not as experts in international relations or conflict resolution theory, but as two people who learned that the most powerful response to human aggression is human compassion. He told the story of their first encounter, the crowd falling silent as he described the moment when Tommy spat at him and his decision to offer kindness instead of anger. Tommy then took the podium, carrying the original handkerchief that had become the symbol of their partnership. This piece of cloth, he said, holding it up for the assembly to see, represents a choice that every person, every community, and every nation faces when confronted with hostility. We can respond with equal hostility, or we can respond with something better. He spoke about his transformation from an angry, desperate man to someone who now helped others find their way out of similar darkness. The same principles that changed my life can change communities, and communities can change nations. When we choose to see the pain behind the anger, when we choose to address causes rather than just symptoms, when we choose to offer hope instead of just punishment, that's when real change becomes possible. The presentation included video testimonials from program participants around the world, showing how their model had been adapted to different cultures and contexts while maintaining its core message of transformative compassion. The response was immediate and powerful. Delegate after delegate requested information about implementing similar programs in their own countries. The European Union announced a pilot program for refugee integration. Several African nations expressed interest in post-conflict reconciliation applications, but the moment that meant the most to both. Michael and Tommy came during the reception following their presentation. Ambassador Chen Wei from China approached them with a story that brought tears to their eyes. My teenage son saw your original video 3 years ago, she told them. He was struggling with anger issues and had been getting into fights at school. Watching your story convinced him to accept help rather than continue down a destructive path. She paused, her diplomatic composure cracking slightly. He is now studying international relations and hopes to work in conflict resolution. He says he wants to be like the guard who chose kindness over protocol. As the reception wound down, Michael and Tommy found themselves alone on a balcony overlooking the East River, reflecting on their incredible journey. "You know what I think our real achievement is?" Tommy said, looking out at the city lights. "That we proved that nobody is beyond redemption. Not the drunk who spits at guards, not the guard who breaks protocol to help, not the communities torn apart by conflict. Everyone can change, everyone can be better, if someone is willing to. See their potential instead of just their problems." Michael nodded, thinking about his daughter Sarah, now 5 years old and growing up in a world where their story was part of the conversation about how people should treat each other. "I want her to grow up understanding that strength isn't about being untouchable," he said. "It's about being willing to be touched by other people's pain and doing something about it." Tommy pulled out his notebook and wrote down those words, adding them to the hundreds of insights that had emerged from their partnership over the years. "So what's next?" he asked. "We've addressed the United Nations, received awards from the Queen, and changed thousands of lives.